Continuing with the video lecture for Chapter 9, this is Part 2. In talking about race, we had talked about different categories of ethnicity. Look at, in a sense, the race that matters in our society, the importance of being white, that, in a sense, because it is the invisible race, it is the default or de facto race of power in this society, there's been increasing recognition of how this may be something that needs further exploration. In a sense, the power of being white in our society has to do with what McIntosh calls an invisible knapsack of privileges. And basically, these privileges mean that you don't run into certain problems. So that we'll find that if you're not white, you encounter certain things, but that being white spares you these indignities. That the idea of white ends up being, of course, socially constructed, that part of the benefit of being white is the way in which individuals end up feeling free from certain kinds of weights that might be imposed upon other groups of individuals, that being white doesn't necessarily mean that the success of one is spoken of as being the success of others. In the bad old days of legal racism, a compliment that was paid to someone who would identify as African American would be that he or she was a credit to his race or her race, which was meant as a compliment, but it basically said that one individual was doing something good for all individuals who would identify in that similar category or characteristic. It gives you an idea how someone who identifies as white feels sufficiently privileged and empowered to be able to make a certain kind of statement that someone who identifies as African American would end up feeling flattered or recognized for being able to be seen as a credit to his or her race. Look at the ways in which minority-majority group relations occur. In this particular instance, minority-majority groups mean that there is no absolute numerical majority, but that there will be relative group majorities. So that instead of saying, historically, for example, as is common in many places, and still remains so today, that more than 50% of the population identifies as white, you might get minority-majority where that number dips below 50, say 45%, but still constitutes the numerical majority. And even with increases in growth rates in certain segments of our society, we'll still see majority white. Park talks about some of the strategies that can unfold the idea of assimilation, where we see individuals adopting all the customs and norms expected of the dominant group in our society. The idea, therefore, of what had been mentioned earlier, of model minority means that these minorities have successfully suppressed their identities that they could claim, the ethnicities that they could claim, in favor of being assimilated and being part of the larger norm. The whole idea that you still have your ethnicity, but that you end up having a society with all these natural differences would be called pluralism. Even if you end up being considered someone who is an American citizen, we still might have situations where, at least from the perspective of Isaacs, one identifies closely with one's homeland culture, because these feelings are deeply experienced, and that this is the concept called primordialism. The benefit of a pluralistic society is that we may not necessarily see that there is a dominant group in that population. The idea of pluralism may be more better capable of encompassing the fuller range of individuals in a particular society, so that, for example, those who are the offspring of the involuntary immigrants that that came to this country through primarily the practice of slavery, would end up having some way of fitting within a larger society rather than necessarily being stigmatized or excluded by the distinction of slavery in his or her past. Even in a pluralistic society, one that recognizes that there are different groups, you could have discrimination, which would be a legal basis for treating peoples individually. Hand in glove with the concept of discrimination is the concept of segregation, where you have a U.S. Supreme Court decision that says that separate but equal is constitutional. So this led to a period of well over a half century of unequal treatment by individuals who would identify as African American today, that this process of segregating individuals in this way was inherently unfair, which is the language that was used once it got overturned. What you ended up getting was a need, therefore, to undo the effects of segregation over a period of time. But that segregation led to a number of practices. You saw individuals being kept into certain districts through a practice known as redlining, so that if individuals were interested in buying property, they might be steered into one neighborhood or versus another, in effect being kept away from perhaps those neighborhoods that were white. Also, you ended up seeing that those neighborhoods were under physical threat through the process called urban renewal, the premise being that tearing down older buildings and replacing them with newer buildings would end up benefiting whoever resided there, but generally speaking, the newer buildings would be outside of the economic reach of the occupants of that particular territory, and what you end up doing is seeing individuals being pushed out of desirable properties. Not surprisingly, when you think about the ideas of race and ethnicity, you can see situations or instances when they can lead to a certain consequence. When you looked at the struggles between the ethnic groups in the country of Rwanda, those who identified as Hutu or those who ended up identifying as Tutsis, you saw that there was a process whereby individuals were sorted from populations and treated in certain ways, that the Hutus, who had not been in power, saw this as an opportunity to strike back at the Tutsis, who ended up allying themselves more so with the colonists who ruled Rwanda for several centuries. What do individuals who are seen to be in a so-called minority race end up doing to these in response to the domination of a majority race? There's always the possibility of withdrawal. So when you saw some of the practices in the American South, which more vigilantly practiced segregation, you saw a flight from those areas by people who identified as African American to the American North and to the American West, where there would be more opportunities. You could see individuals trying to pass, which is claiming to be something that they are not, from the view of those who believe that one's race was an immutable concept. So passing was seen as a kind of a betrayal to one's biological origins. You could see acceptance, which is at best a tepid compliance, that there's no objection that is raised, but it's pretty clear that it is compliance done out of recognition of the superiority of certain groups, and that in the worst case scenario, when you ended up finding individuals who are accepting, they might end up then making a transition to resistance as a way of striking back at their circumstances. Those who had resisted would be seen as the subaltern or oppressed particular group. An aspect of discrimination based on racism would be the concept of prejudice, which is a certain way of treating individuals or thinking about individuals. that discrimination is an illegal practice when looking at criteria related to race in this country. That hasn't always been the case. That essentially came into being in 1964 and 65 with the enactment of certain federal civil rights laws. Merton, a noted sociologist, ended up suggesting that there was a way in which prejudice and discrimination could create a two-axis chart where you would see in one instance where somebody is both prejudiced and discriminates as being an active bigot, and someone who does neither as being a all-weather liberal. The mid portions, or the middle states between the two, is where you have somebody who is prejudiced but does not overtly discriminate, and a fair weather liberal being somebody who is not prejudiced but who does discriminate, so that the timid bigot and fair weather liberal would be the states in between the active bigot and the all-weather liberal, that these are characteristics or qualities that, in the perspective of some, are immutable traits. Race can matter in a number of ways. Look at the example of wealth, that you see such a huge asset gap between people who ended up, who were black versus people who are white, and that this distinction has remained in effect well past the time of legislation that would have ended as a matter of law such unequal treatment. When you look at drops in, for example, in median family net worth from roughly 2006 to 2009, which many identify with the most extreme recent example of recession, for black families you saw a drop in net worth of around 53%, and for whites a loss of only 16%. Even though it's illegal to discriminate based on some criteria such as race, you're still seeing inequality existing and growing since the time of the American Civil Rights Movement. Equity and equality ends up capturing the fact that the disadvantage experienced by a minority group will be something that continues over a period of time. So, for example, if you have a group that has been targeted through racism for a period of time to be denied access to certain job opportunities, for example, then when you see a change in social policy by the abolition of a particular tax, a tax that affects only the wealthy, you end up seeing that the abolition of that tax really is a benefit to the upper class individuals, those who would not identify themselves as the disempowered minority class. Understand, too, that racism could arise even though there's nothing overt about it. From the author's perspective, this is institutional racism, where you end up getting colorblind dynamics and policies unintentionally, probably, to perpetuate certain outcomes for certain racial groups. Look at the way, for example, you see sentencing disparity amongst individuals involving crack cocaine. That crack was able to achieve the kind of high that it did for a relatively cheap amount, but that it carried disproportionately severe penalties when compared to the powdered form of ordinary cocaine. It's kind of hard not to look at that and not conclude that there isn't racism at the root of it, since the differences were so dramatic. What is the future of race? Where is it going to play out? Look at the fact that certain population trends suggest that we are growing into a nation that is increasingly diverse, that especially the Latino and Asian populations will have tripled. You'll also see increases in individuals identifying as with more than one particular racial identity, that the increase in populations like Latinos and Asians are probably going to hurt more severely the African Americans, since those are people who are already at a traditional disadvantage and would be competing for some of the jobs that those larger and growing populations would aspire to. That also the idea of trying to end policies of desegregation can end up backfiring on them. You get in the policy section the discussion of the Ricky versus DiStefano case by the U.S. Supreme Court, where we ended up having the results of a promotional exam amongst firefighters being thrown out because you couldn't achieve certain racial outcomes, that the U.S. Supreme Court said that throwing out that kind of arrangement amounted to a kind of inexcusable racism, even though the ones who are suffering are not the traditional categories that people would associate with discrimination. That racism itself can come in two flavors. You could see with disparate treatment a deliberate attempt to produce unequal outcomes, but with disparate outcomes, you end up having a manifestation of an effect, but not necessarily evidence of that being a desired or sought for outcome. So let me end here the discussion for part 2 of chapter 9 of Intro to Sociology.